Humility, embracing our true place before God. Welcome back to our series on Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. Today, we are going to focus on one of the most fundamental virtues in the spiritual life, humility. St. Francis de Sales teaches that humility is the virtue that helps us recognize our true place before God, embracing both our strengths and our weaknesses with grace. Let's explore what humility really means and how we can cultivate this essential virtue in our lives. Understanding humility. Humility, according to St. Francis de Sales, is the recognition of our dependence on God and an honest acknowledgement of both our strengths and limitations. Humility is not about thinking less of ourselves, but about seeing ourselves clearly as creatures loved by God, yet always in need of His grace. St. Francis de Sales teaches that humility is the foundation of all virtues. Without it, we cannot truly grow in holiness, because humility opens our hearts to receive God's grace. When we acknowledge our limitations, we become more aware of our need for God, and this allows us to grow closer to Him. For example, consider a young seminarian who excels in his studies but recognizes that his abilities are a gift from God. Instead of becoming proud, he humbly acknowledges that all his talents are due to God's grace and seeks to use them for the glory of God rather than for his own recognition. Humility in our vocation. For those of us in religious life, priests, nuns, and seminarians, humility is crucial for fulfilling our vocations. St. Francis de Sales teaches that humility allows us to serve others with love, knowing that our ministry is not about us, but about reflecting God's love to the world. Humility helps us avoid the trap of seeking recognition or praise for our work. Instead, we focus on serving with love and simplicity, knowing that our greatest reward is in being faithful to God's will. St. Francis reminds us that humility in ministry enables us to lead others to Christ, not to ourselves. For example, think of a religious sister who leads her community in a spirit of humility. She listens to each member, values their input, and encourages collaboration. Her leadership is not about asserting her authority, but about serving her sisters with humility and love. The obstacles to humility. While humility is a vital virtue, there are obstacles that can make it difficult to cultivate. St. Francis de Sales highlights some common challenges we may face. Obstacle 1. Pride. Pride is one of the greatest obstacles to humility. When we become too focused on our achievements, our abilities, or our status, we forget that everything we have comes from God. St. Francis de Sales encourages us to keep our eyes fixed on God, remembering that all our gifts are His. Obstacle 2. Comparison. Comparison with others can also hinder our humility. When we compare ourselves to others, whether feeling superior or inferior, it distracts us from our own journey with God. St. Francis de Sales teaches us to focus on our unique calling, trusting that God is working in our lives in a way that's perfectly suited for us. Cultivating humility. So, how can we actively cultivate humility in our lives? St. Francis de Sales offers practical guidance for growing in this virtue. Step 1. Reflect on God's greatness. First, spend time reflecting on God's greatness. When we meditate on the majesty of God, we become more aware of our dependence on Him and our need for His grace. This reflection helps us to see ourselves more clearly and to cultivate a spirit of gratitude for His blessings. Step 2. Serve others with love. Second, actively seek opportunities to serve others, especially in small and unseen ways. Humility is cultivated through service, as it reminds us that we are called to put others' needs before our own. Simple acts of kindness performed with love and without seeking recognition help us grow in humility. Step 3. Embrace your weaknesses. Embrace your weaknesses with humility, because humility doesn't mean denying your strengths, but it does mean accepting your limitations and relying on God's grace to overcome them. St. Francis de Sales teaches that when we are honest about our weaknesses, we open ourselves to God's transforming grace, the fruit of humility. St. Francis de Sales teaches that humility leads to greater peace, joy, and spiritual freedom. When we live in humility, we are no longer burdened by the need for recognition or approval. Instead, we find our security in God's love and grace. Humility opens us to deeper relationships, both with God and with others. It helps us to love without seeking anything in return and to serve without needing to be noticed. Most importantly, humility helps us grow in holiness, as it allows God's grace to work in and through us. In conclusion, humility is the foundation of the devout life. St. Francis de Sales invites us to embrace humility as a way to see ourselves clearly, to serve others with love, and to rely on God's grace in all things. By reflecting on God's greatness, serving others, and embracing our weaknesses, we can grow in this essential virtue and live more fully for God. As we conclude today's session, let's reflect on a few takeaways about humility. Number 1. Humility is seeing ourselves clearly. It involves recognizing our strengths and weaknesses and our complete dependence on God's grace. Secondly, humility enriches our vocation. It allows us to serve others with love and to lead by example, always pointing to God's work in our lives. Thirdly, recognize obstacles to humility. Pride and comparison can hinder our growth in humility. Seek to overcome these challenges. Fourthly, practical steps to cultivate humility. Reflect on God's greatness, serve others in simple ways, and embrace your weaknesses with grace. And finally, the fruit of humility is peace and joy. Living in humility frees us from seeking recognition and allows us to grow in love and holiness. Thank you for joining me today as we explored the virtue of humility. In our next episode, we will discuss the importance of hope and how it anchors our faith in God's promises. Until then, live Jesus.